these markings on the ground here in the mountains of Ararat, that these are the last remnants of Noah's Ark, kind of shipwrecked, if you like, here on this mountainside.
There is a ridge in the mountains of eastern Turkey that, from an airplane window, looks unmistakably like the outline of a ship. It sits roughly 18 miles south of Mount Ararat, near a smaller peak called Tenderek, at an elevation of about 6,500 feet. It is around 500 feet long, tapered at both ends, and set into a landscape of volcanic rock and old mud flows. For almost 70 years, people have argued about what it actually is. Some of them are geologists. Some of them are theologians. Some of them are television producers. And in the last 2 years, a fresh round of scans, soil tests, and excavation permits has put the site back in the news, with headlines just as dramatic as the ones from 1960. This is the real story of that formation. What has actually been found there, who found it, why the mainstream geological community remains unconvinced, and why a shape on a hillside keeps pulling people back to it generation after generation. The formation's public history begins in 1959, not with an archaeologist but with a soldier. Ilan Durupaner was a captain in the Turkish army, doing aerial cartographic work as part of a NATO mapping survey of the region. Looking over photographs taken from above the Tenderek range, he noticed a long, symmetrical, boat-shaped ridge that stood out from the jagged terrain around it. He wasn't looking for Noah's Arkansas. He was making maps. But the shape was distinctive enough that when the photograph reached wider circulation, people who were already primed to look for a giant ship in that part of the world seized on it immediately. The formation actually has an earlier, quieter history. Local Kurdish residents in the valley had apparently referred to the ridge by a name that translates loosely to the ship long before Durupaner's photograph existed, and the shape itself may have become more visible after a combination of heavy rain and regional seismic activity in 1948 reshaped the exposed slope. Whether the outline was equally visible before that period is hard to establish, since there was no earlier aerial survey to compare it against. What is well documented is that once the 1959 photo circulated, the Turkish government sent its own survey team to look at the site. That early government assessment described the feature in geological terms, a landslide or mudflow structure, and did not treat it as an archaeological discovery. For most of the 1960s and 1970s, the formation sat in relative obscurity outside a small circle of biblical archaeology enthusiasts. The person most responsible for turning the Durupaner Formation into a recurring media story was not a geologist. Ron Wyatt was a nurse anesthetist from Tennessee with no formal training in archaeology or geology. He came across the aerial photograph in the late 1970s, traveled to the site, and became convinced almost immediately that he was looking at the fossilized remains of Noah's Arkansas. Over the following 2 decades, he made repeated trips to the formation, and he built an entire body of claims around it, that he had found petrified wood, that there were metallic rivets or fittings buried in the ridge, that ground-penetrating equipment had picked up regular internal patterns consistent with a ship's frame, and that boulders in a nearby valley, carved with holes and standing upright in rows, were the drogue stones, used to stabilize the vessel during the flood. In 1985, Wyatt was joined at the site by David Fausold, a marine salvage expert, and geophysicist John Baumgardner. Fausold brought early ground-penetrating radar equipment tuned to detect iron, and by his own account, the readings excited him enormously. He described the formation as looking like a shipwreck from the moment he saw it, and he came away convinced the scans showed a regular internal structure roughly matching the length of Noah's Ark as described in Genesis, once a particular ancient cubit measurement was applied. Fausold's 1988 book on the expedition, and Wyatt's own lectures and self-published material, are the primary source of almost every specific claim that still circulates today: the petrified ribs, the anchor stones, the internal rooms. Wyatt was a passionate and controversial figure. Supporters called him a pioneer. The wider archaeological and geological community was, from the start, deeply skeptical, both of his methods and of his interpretation of the data. He died in 1999, still maintaining that he had found the Ark. Here is the detail that most retellings of this story leave out, and it matters enormously. David Fausold, the man whose radar survey produced the original "It's a Ship" excitement, changed his mind. In September 1994, he returned to the site with Australian geologist Ian Plimer and came away doubting his earlier conclusions. 2 years later, in 1996, Fausold co-authored a peer-reviewed paper with geologist Lawrence Collins titled, bluntly, "Bogus Noah's Ark from Turkey Exposed as a Common Geologic Structure." Their joint conclusion was that the Durupiner Formation is a naturally occurring geological feature, specifically a type of fold structure called a doubly plunging syncline, made of sedimentary rock that had been pushed up and shaped by regional landslide and erosion processes, with limonite, an iron-rich mineral, forming along natural fractures in ways that can look deceptively like straight lines and right angles from a distance or on early radar equipment. This is a significant reversal from one of the two men most responsible for popularizing the site, and it did not travel nearly as far as the original claims did. Several other Christian researchers who went to the site specifically hoping to confirm the Ark identification, including Bill Krause, Gordon Franz, and others associated with creationist and biblical archaeology organizations, likewise published findings rejecting it. In other words, some of the strongest skepticism about the Durupiner site has come not from secular scientists dismissing a religious claim out of hand, but from researchers sympathetic to the search for the Ark who examined the formation closely and concluded it wasn't it. The dominant scientific explanation for the Durupiner Formation has been fairly stable since the 1990s. Geologists who have studied the site, including Lawrence Collins in the United States and Turkish researchers who have mapped the surrounding Tenderek and Dolgebayasat region, describe it as a natural landslide and erosion feature sitting within a broader zone of documented mass movement geology. The area around the formation, sometimes referred to in the literature as the Telseker landslide region, has a well-mapped history of large-scale slope failures, and Turkish government geological surveys from the 1980s specifically examined whether the boat-shaped ridge was part of that same system. Their answer was yes. Under this explanation, the right angles and parallel lines that show up in ground-penetrating radar and that get described in press coverage as looking architectural are attributed to natural processes. The way sedimentary rock fractures along predictable joint planes, and the way limonite, an iron oxide mineral, precipitates and hardens along those fractures, creating patterns that can look regular or geometric without being man-made. Geologist Lawrence Collins, one of the most persistent critics of the Ark identification, has specifically classified the site as a natural limonite formation shaped by mudflow. Critics have also pointed to a more basic problem with the biblical fit. Genesis 8 verse 4 describes the Ark coming to rest on the mountains of Ararat, and the Durupiner Formation sits not on a mountain but partway down a valley slope, a detail that even some Ark researchers acknowledge complicates the geography. None of this means every geologist has visited the site or that the matter has been the subject of extensive modern peer-reviewed literature. It has not been a major focus of academic geology, largely because most professional geologists don't consider the Ark hypothesis to be a serious starting point worth extensively retesting. The 1996 Collins and Fazzold paper remains the most frequently cited technical rebuttal, and more recent Turkish-language geological interpretations, including a 2025 paper reinforcing the syncline and landslide explanation, have continued in the same direction. The reason the Durupiner Formation is back in headlines in 2025 and 2026 is a specific, named project called Noah's Ark Scans, led by American researcher Andrew Jones, who has reportedly been investigating the site on and off for nearly 3 decades. Working with Turkish institutions, Istanbul Technical University and Agri Ibrahim Season University have both been named in connection with the project. Along with researchers connected to Andrews University in the United States, the team has conducted a new round of ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, and LiDAR surveys, along with soil sampling from inside and outside the formation's boundary. Their publicly reported findings, as of the most recent coverage, include several specific claims. Radar and resistivity scans reportedly show angular structures and what the team describes as tunnel-like features extending several meters below the surface, including a corridor roughly 13 meters long. Soil samples taken from inside the formation, compared against samples from the surrounding slope, reportedly showed elevated organic matter and potassium. Readings the team has said are consistent with, though not proof of, decayed wood or other organic material. Some reporting has also described traces of clay-like material and marine-associated deposits, including mollusk remains, in samples taken from the site. Jones and his colleagues have been careful, at least in their public statements, to frame this as suggestive rather than conclusive, and the team has said further radiocarbon dating and additional surveys are planned in upcoming field seasons, with results intended for peer review. It's worth being precise about what this project has and has not claimed. Andrew Jones has been quoted directly asking whether the site could be man-made or an extraordinary natural formation, and stating plainly that more data is needed. That is a meaningfully different posture than declaring a discovery. The strongest specific claim reported from the team is that organic matter inside the formation measured roughly 3 times higher than in the surrounding soil, a real and testable data point, but one that, on its own, is consistent with several explanations besides a decomposed wooden ship, including buried vegetation, peat-like deposits, or organic material transported and trapped by the same landslide processes mainstream geologists already point to. Turkish authorities have historically restricted excavation at the site, in part because of its protected status. The government designated the area a national park in 1987, explicitly in recognition of its cultural and religious significance rather than as confirmation of the Ark identification. Any further invasive excavation would require additional regulatory approval, which is one reason the project has moved cautiously and relied primarily on non-invasive scanning methods so far. One detail from the Wyatt era that has persisted, and that does have a physical verifiable basis, is the presence of large carved stones in a valley near the village of Kazan, some distance from the formation itself. These stones are real, they are large, and several of them do have holes bored through them near the top. Local tradition refers to them as anchor or drogue stones, tied to the Ark story. Skeptical researchers, including those behind the more recent debunking literature, have argued these stones are more plausibly explained as boundary markers, grave markers, or ritual standing stones from a later period, a known category of monument in the ancient Near East and Caucasus region, rather than as ship's equipment, and that their placement and the crosses carved into some of them, which are generally dated to the early Christian era, fit a funerary or memorial tradition better than a nautical one. As with the formation itself, the stones are an undisputed physical feature. Their interpretation is the contested part. There's a reason this particular site resurfaces every few years with a new round of dramatic claims, and it isn't a conspiracy. It's a combination of a few real, human factors. The formation genuinely does look like a ship from above, which is a striking enough coincidence that it invites explanation. Its dimensions genuinely are in a plausible range for what different cubit measurements would put Noah's Ark at, which invites people to treat a rough numerical match as more significant than it may be, especially when there is more than one ancient cubit length to choose from, giving some latitude in finding a fit. The region is genuinely rich with flood narratives across dozens of ancient cultures, which lends the search cultural and emotional weight far beyond one hillside in Turkey. And the site has a genuinely tangled research history, with real reversals, real disagreements between qualified people, and real restrictions on access, which makes it easy to frame ordinary scientific caution. We need more data, further study is required, as if it were secrecy or suppression. It's also true that dramatized, unverified retellings of this story circulate constantly online, often invoking fictional details that don't appear in any actual reporting. Secret footage that was supposedly filmed and then withheld, researchers who supposedly went silent or disappeared after seeing something disturbing, technicians who supposedly stopped sleeping after handling samples. None of that appears in the documented history of the Durupener Formation or in the reporting on the current Noah's Ark Scans project. The real story is less cinematic and more ordinary. A genuinely strange-looking rock formation, a small, persistent group of researchers who believe it's significant, a much larger body of geologists who think the evidence points to a natural explanation, and an excavation process moving slowly because of both scientific caution and Turkish regulatory limits on the protected site. As of the most recent reporting, no radiocarbon dating results, peer-reviewed confirmation, or definitive excavation findings have been published that settle the question either way. The Noah's Ark Scans team has said additional fieldwork and lab analysis are planned. The mainstream geological interpretation, a natural syncline shaped by landslide and erosion, with limonite mineralization producing some misleadingly regular-looking patterns, remains the position held by most geologists who have examined the published data, including the two men, Fausold and Collins, whose own reversal in the 1990s is one of the more underreported chapters of this whole story. What can be said honestly is this: the formation is real, its shape is a genuine and striking coincidence, its dimensions are in the range that some ancient cubit measurements would assign to Noah's Ark, and there are real ongoing scientific investigations happening there right now, with real institutions attached to them. What has not happened is confirmation. No peer-reviewed study has verified the site as a ship, ancient or otherwise, and the researchers most directly involved in the current project have, in their own public statements, stopped short of making that claim themselves. Whether that changes in the next round of fieldwork is genuinely an open question, which is a very different thing from a secret already being hidden from the public.